Tuesday, June 24th, 2025 to order. We'll go ahead and start with the capital bond measure. So if we'll turn it over to Megan.
Okay. Yes. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, City Council. We're going to have another conversation this evening about the capital bond projects and specifically talk about the ballot language scoping. We have a number of folks here with us this evening. Alex and I, assistant to the city manager, will be presenting along with Maddie Prodanovich with Hilltop Securities. And then we also have Butler Snow, our bond counsel here. Dalton is here in the back in case you have questions, and we'll be happy to answer any questions after we go through a brief presentation. So the agenda for this evening is to talk about a little background on this matter, and then we'll go through the ballot language scoping discussion around financing and phasing, and then we have some language considerations for you. We'll talk about next steps and then discussion and direction. So in terms of background, just as a reminder, we kind of have been discussing with council some of the capital improvement needs throughout the city. And we have significant capital needs, but after going through some needs assessments and looking at some of the kind of significant needs around our facilities and amenities and what our needs are in serving the community, we identified the BBRC, the Recreation Center, and the City Hall and a new Civic Center and the Services Center as our top priorities for the most immediate needs for improvements to our capital projects. Over the past 6 months, we've had a lot of discussion and a lot of activities and touch points. Just to recap, in January and February, we had conversations with council regarding the project identification and looking at some financing options and what the community interest was around these projects. We then, between February and May, did a significant amount of community outreach and engagement, including polling. We conducted some statistically valid polling with the community to get kind of their temperature reading about how they felt about the projects. We also did a lot of community meetings, online survey, and we did some community engagement with boards and commissions, as well as on-site community engagement at facilities, things like Art Night Out and some other kind of resident engagement during that time. We then came to council in May with kind of the results of that to get council direction on moving forward. Council gave us direction at that time to move forward with the capital projects ballot measure, but recognize that we need a little bit more discussion about what projects to include in the ballot measure. So here we are tonight, and we're hoping to finalize the scope of work and get further direction from you all. We want to recap some of the things that we heard with the community engagement, and just to start with the polling. The poll, as you recall, was quite extensive, and we got a lot of feedback from the community. We got everything from kind of that top line information about the community sentiment around their confidence in the city and their confidence in how the city is kind of running. We got information on their feedback on the projects before having any information about the projects themselves, and then feedback on the projects after being educated a little bit. But in terms of the kind of top line responses, you can see here that with the question that we asked for each of the 3 capital projects, please indicate whether the inclusion of this project on the ballot makes you more likely to vote yes and approve a tax increase, or more likely to vote no and then reject a tax increase, or if it does not make a difference to you in your decision. And as you can see, with each of the 3 projects, with the BBRC, 79% of voters indicated that they would be more likely to approve a ballot measure, with the Civic Center, 58%, and with the Service Center, 64%. So we generally got pretty good favorability for these projects from the community. We also took all of the engagement response, including the responses to the survey that we conducted, as well as the information that we kind of gleaned from the engagement, and pulled them together in these key themes. And the key themes that we heard from the community were that the service center and the recreation center projects received the most support, although all were favorable by the community. And while there is concern about increased taxes, property tax was more favorable than sales tax. And there is concern over the timing of projects. As you know, when we started this discussion, it was right with the community, it was right around March, which was kind of when the whole tariffs discussion started. There has been a lot of uncertainty in the economy and just with what's been happening at the national and international level over the past 6 months. And so I think that's been, weighing on the voters' minds. So that's a consideration. And we heard that these projects are really viewed as a positive investment in Lafayette's future. So we're going to talk a little bit about financing options. Again, we've had a lot of discussion about this, but we wanted to come back and provide a little bit more information about some financing options around phasing. So we reviewed several financing options with you and determined that a general obligation bond with a property tax for repayment is going to be the best option for what our needs are and what our revenue generating mechanisms are here at the city. With a 20-year general obligation bond scenario is what we've modeled. And if council would like to advance the two largest projects, so the BBRC and the Civic Center, those were the two projects that are about $34 million cost estimate. We believe that phasing debt issuance would be ideal because this would allow us to align the debt issuance with our capacity to design and construct the projects and still meet the requirement to expend the proceeds within the required timeline. And this would also be well aligned with our capacity at the city to construct them in a way that would minimize the impacts to our operations, to staff, and to residents in terms of constructing them and having kind of impacts on our operations. So I'm going to turn it over to Maddie to give a little bit more detail about kind of what this would look like and what she's modeled in terms of what that might look like.
Great, thanks, Megan. So, and good evening. Thanks for having me back. So in addition to the considerations on the city side from construction of projects, there's also a requirement, and this is a little bit more in Dalton's wheelhouse as bond counsel than mine, but at the time of issuance, the city needs to certify a few things in order for these bonds to be eligible to be tax exempt, which is what we want because that gets you the lowest borrowing cost. The first is that, the proceeds need to be used towards good public purpose capital projects, so not for operations and not for private use. So we don't have, those issues here, obviously. So to the second piece that we care a lot about is, particularly to Megan's commentary on the prior slide, is that the city needs to have a reasonable expectation to spend 85% of proceeds within 3 years. And that essentially allows you to be able to certify and bond counsel to give their opinion that, there's no over-issuance here. We're not, intentionally creating some arbitrage issues and things like that. So because of that, when we start doing sort of larger bond programs, and we see this a bit more on the school district side, but it does happen on the city side as well, we typically see then the staggering of issuances. So you may be asking for authorization for all projects, but you're not actually going to issue bond all of that authorization. So all, in this instance, 74 million at one time. You would do, a single issuance first that would go towards one or two projects, and then, 2 or 3 years later, you do a second issuance to construct the remaining project. And so as far as overall timing, big picture, if you decide to put something on the ballot this November, and if it is successful, then really the soonest you would be able to sort of go issue bonds and have proceeds in hand to start on projects would be kind of January or February of next year. And that's just because after the election in early November, there's some processes that we have to go through, both to come back to you all to actually get approval to issue the debt related to the authorization, and then there's some documentation and disclosure and things like that has to happen to be able to go sell bonds in the market. That said, you're not required to turn around and issue bonds immediately. There are many entities that receive voter authorization and then spend some time doing, some additional design or architecture work, you can reimburse yourself with proceeds from bonds. So if the choice was to wait a little bit and get a better sense of what the project scope looks like, you can, start on that and use essentially available city dollars within a fiscal year, and then, plan on issuing bonds maybe a little bit later in 2026 to reimburse yourself and to fund the project. And then again, that first issuance can be structured to fund one or two projects if you decide to go with the larger package, and then maintain some of that authorization for a future issuance. That then brings up a second question of when we're talking about a 20-year term, what do you envision for that? Is that 20 years in total that the tax is in place, or is it 20 years for each issuance, right? If you think about kind of maybe like with a mortgage, you take out like an equity line or something like that, right? You're kind of adding on to, you could try and just increase your annual payment and keep it with the same final term, or you can kind of have another term essentially on those bonds. And so the next slide to kind of, I always think visual representation is a little bit helpful in this instance. And it's hard because this, we're not talking about huge numbers, but they do matter. So option 1 here on that left side is a 20-year term for the total authorization. So this assumes, again, the first issuance can change and could be pushed back a year, and that would just sort of push everything back a year. But we are, in this instance, just for visual purposes, assuming an issuance, early in 2026 with a 20-year term, and then a second issuance 2 years later in 2028 with essentially an 18-year term. So that is actually keeping the entire authorization within 20 years. It compared between the two here, it's a slightly higher annual payment because, right, we're paying that off in a shorter duration, but a lower total repayment because you're paying less interest, right? Because we're amortizing it a bit faster. Option 2 here would be if each term is 20 years. So you'll see, the blue bars, essentially that first issuance go out for 20 years, and then assuming an issuance 2 years later, the green bars for 2028 go out their own 20 years. So we're actually at 22 years for the total term of repayment in that option. It results in a slightly lower maximum annual payment, so lower tax impact in that instance, but a higher total repayment because we are paying, instead of an 18-year bond on that second issuance, we're actually at 20 years, right? So 22 over the whole period of time. So again, the differences are somewhat minimal, particularly if you think about on the max annual, that $300,000 difference in annual payment is somewhat immaterial to your overall like mill levy and tax impacts for voters. But the total repayment, $5 million or a little under that of total repayment of interest is obviously meaningful. I think the big takeaway here is we just, I know this came up at the last meeting that we were at, is sort of what would this look like and what are the impacts of this. And so I think we wanted to be responsive to that, but this also is not a decision you have to make today. I think we're going to go a little bit later through some of the ballot questions, and there's some parameters and numbers in there that are creating the box that we would have to fit the debt authorization within. And our recommendation always is to give yourself the most flexibility, because sitting here today, we don't know how anything's going to play out over the next 3 months, 6 months, let alone 2-3 years. And so those parameters are meant to allow you the flexibility to do either of these or even some other alternative that may come up, as the city starts working through the planning process, assuming a successful election, if you choose to put something on the ballot. But we did just want to be responsive to show that these are the options that we would really be coming back to you with, again, pending a successful election this November.
Thank you, Maddie. And the last piece on this, the financial component, is we do want to note that there have been some data changes. And when we began these discussions in early this year, we were using the 2024 property tax assessment and property tax data because that's what was available at the time. And we're basing those calculations off of the 2024 average home price for Lafayette and all the estimates you saw, which, if you'll recall, for all three projects, for the average cost of a home in Lafayette over the 20 years, it would be about $296 per house for the year. That's what we were showing in previous discussions. That assumed a single issuance for all three projects, so not doing the phasing that we were just discussing with Maddie. However, since those discussions, we've actually been able to receive at least the preliminary and still uncertified, but but updated assessment and property tax data, which showed a slightly higher increase to the average home price. We've also been able to further refine the models and the scenarios to get to that phasing piece, which all ultimately resulted in a slight reduction of what we would estimate about $10 to $15 per house per year in that total project package for the property tax increase. So we'll pause there to see if there are any questions on the financing piece, and then next we'll go into the actual language development.
Anyone have questions?
I do. I'm
Counselor
curious.
Freeland?
Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm kind of thinking about, like the smaller pieces. I mean, we have such a big ask that we're thinking about, which makes a lot of sense because we have a larger, but if we have a smaller, like the service center, for example, which is it's not a huge amount. That seems like something we would maybe structure in a different way, potentially, because we would say, look, we don't want to spend 20 years paying it off if we could pay it off in 10 or 5. Would we have the flexibility to do something like that, to say, look, for this small amount, let's do a really tight payback? Would we have that flexibility in sort of what we've started going, the path that we've been going down so far?
Yeah, I think the big question would be, you can certainly shorten, you're going to issue bonds, you're just going to issue a series of bonds, right? And so from that perspective, an individual investor or really anybody isn't necessarily going to be able to see how you're internally allocating, this portion is towards this and this portion is towards that. That said, we can certainly do that. And to do so, we can shorten like an amortization of that piece specifically. I think the question is, we can do that and still kind of stay within the parameters and the big picture conversations we've been having. If you then wanted to, though, kind of look at it differently where you're truly amortizing it faster and not impacting amortization for other projects, then you're probably going to have a higher maximum annual parameter that we'd want to put in, and that's going to change the tax impact a bit, right? And so I think we certainly have a good amount of flexibility in the parameters now. If you want to do so without impacting the tax impacts, then we would want to kind of probably reevaluate that.
Right, but it would have to be for the entire term of the request, of the authorization.
I mean, you can have step down, so you could say, for the first 5 years or 10 years, the annual debt service payment's actually going to be $7 million, let's say. And then it would drop down to 4 because of, how quickly you amortize the service center portion. That, though, I will say, I'm not a political consultant and I don't deal with communications, but that is something that's really complicated, I would say, to explain to voters. I think that a lot of times when we see things like that, folks have a hard time kind of understanding why. And that's why we typically see kind of these more generic payment structures similar to like a mortgage.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. So now we'll turn the discussion to the language considerations and the actual components to developing the bond measure language. So when we're talking about what's necessary to come to you all with draft language, there's really 3 key variables. The first is, of course, the project package, the projects that are being advanced and included in the question. The second would be the question structure. That's looking at one question for all projects or separating out into multiple questions. And then the third is the type and length of issuance, which really gets to everything Maddie was just covering about the phasing. And as you mentioned, as you heard, the language that we would propose and bring forward would provide the flexibility to not really need a discussion on that this evening, or direction on that this evening, rather. So you saw this chart in your memo. It's a little complicated, but it's intended to map out all the different options for you this evening based on those 3 components. Again, we start with the project package and then work towards the question structure and then ultimately the type and length of issuance. But again, as we don't necessarily need the direction on that language piece, tonight we'll focus just on the project package and the question structure, and that'll kind of, and then as we discuss potential issuance in the future, we can talk about the type and length of issuance. So when we're working through this, the first question will be the project package. Is council interested in advancing all 3 projects, the BBRC, the Civic Center, and the Service Center? or as was discussed at the workshop in May, just focusing on the BBRC and Service Center. From there, we can kind of talk about how the questions would be structured. With either of those packages, council would have the option of advancing a single question with either all three or all two. Or for that first one, the question was brought up at the workshop last month to do a separate question for the Civic Center, which would be an option. So do one question for BBRC and the Service Center, and then a second for the Civic Center. Fortunately, they couldn't be here this evening, but you are all familiar with Magellan Strategies. They worked on the poll and do that sort of polling and tracking of these ballot measures throughout the state. And again, they couldn't be here this evening, but they were able to share just kind of some anecdotal evidence of a neighboring community that did that, and it led to unsuccessful results on the ballot question.
Did what?
Separating out the questions like that.
Okay.
So to kind of inform the conversation, we did work with our bond counsel to draft some language to look at. It's a lot. I'm not going to read all of it for you this evening, but we'll just call out a couple components that will change based on the direction we get from council. So all of the questions you'll see really begin with just the statement of how much the debt should be increased for the city, including the actual debt, and then the total repayment costs, including principal and interest. So here, this first example is one question with all three projects. That's the $74 million debt increase that we've discussed, total repayment costs of $120 million, including principal and interest, and then listing those three projects. And then the remainder of that language is really kind of establishing the total, the information that would be needed to adopt an updated mill levy and the total property tax that could be levied to fund this debt service. And so you'll see here, there's that $6 million listed there, and then the rest of the language would provide that flexibility that would allow the flexibility for issuances. The second example, this is demonstrating what it would look like to separate out the projects. So this first one is showing BBRC and Service Center. It looks very, very similar. You'll see there's a reduced amount of debt in that first line down to $40 million with a related reduction in the total repayment cost for principal and interest, this time just showing BBRC and the Service Center. And then the partner question in the second example would be a single question for the Civic Center. And so before turning it over to council for any questions and discussion and direction, we do just kind of want to note, again, you've seen this similar timeline, but just note where we are in this process. We've covered a lot of ground. We've, of course, began with engagements back in April. We did polling at the same time, came before you to present those results, and now we're here tonight to seek direction on the language itself. And then from this direction, we'll be able to embark on the second phase of engagement, which will be much more focused on getting information out and communicating information about this bond package. So we would utilize a lot of the same tools we used in the first phase of engagement, including newsletters, social media, utility bill inserts, things like that. We would also kind of utilize some tools to really promote the understanding and engagement of the facilities. So maybe conducting facility tours and creating videos of the facilities that we could use on social media, use at some of these meetings, holding more informational sessions with community partners, things like that. So from there, we'll come back in July with taking any direction from tonight to actually show you draft language based on this direction, and then we'll return in August for certification of that ballot language. So with that, we'll turn it over to the Mayor Pro Tem, see if there are any questions and discussion.
Thoughts? Anybody want to start, or?
Do you want to go after each question in turn, or?
We can go after each question in turn.
Okay.
So.
I mean, I think that top one, if I may,
Please.
if that would be helpful. I think providing the most amount of flexibility in the repayment is important, right? It allows us as things change and, things get worse, things get better budget-wise, we can really have the flexibility. So I think the most flexibility we can build in is really valuable. I think even to that question of, I don't know if necessarily it's a good idea really to increase the 20-year repayment limit in order to have the ability in the short term to pay back a smaller one. That seems like a lot and very confusing, so I'm not sure if that's a good idea, but I think that spirit of allowing us to sort of really try to be as flexible as possible to, you know, if we have the ability at some certain points to pay down the debt faster, I mean, that's great, right? $120 million for a $75 million project. It's a lot of money that if we could shave that off a couple million throughout 20 years, that's great. That's an important thing to do. So I think having the flexibility to be able to do that sometime, if we have that opportunity, is an important thing to try to build in if we can.
Anyone else? Thoughts? Well, I will say that I do agree with the flexibility in the language as well. I think that that gives us the ability to address the issue for the time that, of what may be going on within that, the larger city or the, so I think that gives us the ability to adapt and adjust. So I'm supportive of that as well. Anybody else?
I'll just say that I do think it's important to have flexibility simply because there's so many unknowns. I just think it's critical at this point to be able to not strap, because this is going to be a long process, to not strap the future of the finances around this to constrain it too much.
Okay. Anybody else who hasn't spoken? Do we want to move on to the second question as far as what council's thinking regarding the three projects? Do we want to take it as talking about each one? Do we want, I know we've had lots of conversations, so what are people's thoughts? Are we looking at the three different projects, or are we looking at the number of questions we're at? Just kind of thoughts.
Well, based on the statement from Magellan that splitting it up to two questions, that I'm opposed to splitting it up in that way, meaning it's either two projects or three projects, one question.
Wait, say that again?
It looked like we had been given that there's three options, language structure, language options. One question, all three projects, two questions, so it split up the three, or one question, two projects. Yeah, that's the page. And I'm saying that for me, it's the question structure is just one question. Not multiple questions, just one question. So either one question, two projects, or one question, three projects. Because Magellan said that putting the two questions on was not, I don't know what the term was used, successful, conducive, understandable, but it sounded like it just didn't.
Yeah, I'll give the example that they wanted to share with us, right? So City of Longmont went out in 2023 and they had three different projects, all probably pretty popular and polled well at the beginning. One was the library, one was a rec center with an affordable housing component, and one was kind of an art center, entertainment center. And so while they polled kind of in the 60% range in favor, when they did the pre-polling, the actual results were 65% failed for the recs. I'm not gonna get the right numbers, but 65 to 68% failed. So it kind of oppositely flipped when they were on three sides. And so, while it's, one example, and certainly they wouldn't hang their hat on it, they have seen that when you do separate it out, you almost pit them against each other and they end up largely failing. So again, staff would recommend just one question, and it is to council kind of that the three projects or two projects, because we heard you kind of struggle with the size and the amount of projects. So, and then from there we can take the next steps, but it's really a policy decision at this point.
Yes.
So when we last had this conversation, I think I said that I was supportive of all three. And I don't know if it's sort of the uncertainty that we have in the economy or property tax impacts continuing to sort of be understood, but I'm feeling a little less excited about going all three right now. And thinking more of, do we do something a little more limited? And in my mind, what that means would be the service center, because I feel like we need that. Updates to the rec center, which I feel like we need. And those two being where we go. That doesn't include the civic center, obviously. And I think in my mind as well, it doesn't include the full rec center project that's been scoped, and more the more limited one that we've also discussed a bit. And, I think it's tough, right? Because that would be kicking the can down the road on the civic center, certainly. And I kind of feel like that's what's been done for quite a long time. And so I don't love that, because at some point, some council is gonna have to make the tough decision of, we need to build a new facility because this one's not meeting our needs. But it just feels like right now, the economy, the uncertainty, I would hate for us to go really, really big right now with sort of what we know. And, I think in the future, we have another chance to come back with the civic center question. Once we maybe get into a little more certain ground. So I think that's sort of how I'm feeling. And I think that also to me feels like a really strong basis to try to convince the voters, right? That we know this is an increase, we understand, but we're really trying to be prudent here and looking at things that really need to be done. And while we wish we could do everything and wish we could have our, everything we want, we just don't feel like it's the right time to be asking that of you. And so we're trying to be reasonable in our ask. And I would hope that would resonate with people right now too. Because I think a lot of people are feeling that sort of economic uncertainty a little bit. So that's how I'm feeling right now.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll say that I was able to attend the Commuting Solutions meeting today, and there was a briefing from both Senator Winter and Representative, forgetting her last name, but it was sobering. So looking at the state's situation specifically, and knowing that resilience is a big piece of what we have to also build in, I think this is the wisest move is to, I like the one question, two projects, because it does, the other thing, of course, right after that, I looked at how do we sustain ourselves in the city and residents, and I think both of these, the rec center serving a lot of the residents and the service center serving the people who are serving the residents, I think it's wise at this point to bundle those two together. And yeah, the civic center is a question, but I think our responsibility right now, I feel, is around unfortunately leaving the civic center to a future question and putting on the ballot with flexible, repayment as one question, two projects. So that's where I land.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Just clarification, one question, two projects, right?
Right.
Cool. That's where I'm at. I'm at one question, not necessarily two projects, three projects. I can see the benefits of both. I think at our last time we spoke about this, someone, I think it was Councilor Sampson, brought up the fact that we're finally being proactive about something with the Civic Center. Whereas I would hate, and this is the only reason I'm leaning towards three projects, I would hate for the Civic Center to be in a position like the Service Center or the Rec Center 5 years from now and have that council be forced to make the decision because it's just too far gone. So I hear you. I think eventually someone's going to have to make that decision. The council's going to have to put that on the ballot. And that's why I'm willing to go 3 projects, because why not be proactive about something for once, right? I don't want this place to be like the rec center and the service center 5 years down the road. So that's where I'm at. One question, I'm willing to do 2 projects, but I could definitely see the benefit in doing all 3.
Anyone else? Thoughts?
Well, I would like to move all 3 projects forward because I do see the benefit in being proactive, and I agree with Councilor Tapia Vega in that we don't want to put a future council in the position that this has to pass or something even bigger may happen to the building. We're continuing to grow, that's obvious. I do think we need to accommodate that growth. I do like the 2-question option. It seemed, after reading through the comments, that there was the most opposition to the Civic Center, so I would want to give the voters that choice.
Okay, so what you're saying is 2 questions, 3 projects?
Yes.
I'm not going to be any help, so go ahead.
No questions, cancel the election. Got it. Just kidding, sorry.
School lunch.
So I think I agree with Councilor Tapia Vega that I think, again, the 3 projects need to be put out there. I'm open to 1 or 2 questions, but I do think we need to give it, because again, I see us, again, kicking the can down the road and knowing the amount of money that we've already put into the renovations of existing City Hall. Because I know we've done that over the last, 5 years? We've put in a significant amount of money already. And so if we don't address the real issues, I think that it's just kicking the can in the City Hall. I mean, when you think about just looking around and thinking about what we spent on the current updates, and when you look at that we're missing like a sprinkler system, that there would just be, we need to look at that piece of it. We need to look at the fact that, again, we have a piece of land. I think we're already part of the way there, that we've got a place to put it. It's just a matter of building. And then I think that from some of the financing, especially when you look at potentially even look at selling this property and potentially how that could help offset some of the cost for that project, I'm really inclined in moving 3 projects forward. So I don't know if that gives us any kind of consensus, because it seems like we've got 3 and 2 for 2 projects, or 2 for 2 projects, 3 for 3 projects. I don't know if Councilor Sampson wants to weigh in. I know that we do have time, so if we want to hold this off until the July workshop, but I'm looking at the city manager to make sure I'm correct in that.
It
that we
would
do have
likely
time.
need to be at a regular meeting in your July because we would need to certify a resolution in early August. So I would not want to punt to late July, but perhaps at your next meeting or the meeting on the 15th would provide us ample time.
Do we think we need that additional time to think about it, or are we willing to have more conversation and kind of work through it right now?
So where are we not seeing eye to eye? Is the questions, is the project? It's both, right?
I
We're
think
kind
it's
of all
both.
over the place. Okay.
So how many people are here for 1 question? I only heard 1 person say 2 questions. Did I?
No, actually, you're right, I think that there was only one person that said 2 questions. Yeah, and I was open to it, but I'm fine with 1 as well. So that's a good point. I think we're in consensus with 1 question. It's just number of projects. Thank you for clarifying that.
I mean, since this is a workshop, I think, you know, one option we have available to us is our direction is we're not in agreement right now and we can't vote right now. So we need to move forward with sort of the 2 competing ideas and then at a regular meeting,
And hold a vote.
hold a vote at that point. If we can't come to consensus tonight, which I don't know if that's true or not, but that is an option available to us.
I mean, I can go either way, that's my problem. I think actually, between 3 projects and 2 projects, it's sort of a, okay, you run the 3 projects, if it fails, you learn from it, and you rerun the question next year, right? You could run the 2 projects, because we have a higher confidence level that the 2 projects are gonna run, and then, when the bond market gets better in 3 to 4 years, you run the other question. It will push the Civic Center out, but as we talked about, we have to issue the bonds within 3-year period. Will we be able to do that and get what we need? That's why I'm saying, it, to me, I'm not very helpful because I can see benefits to either.
So I do just want to clarify that authorization is valid for a longer period of time than the 3 years. We just use sort of 2 or 3 years as the example, but Dalton can weigh in, but I know for sure, you know, they're comfortable with that authorization being valid for at least 10 years. I think really 20 is the,
So they can wait to issue bonds for 10 years? Well, that doesn't seem very nice to the public.
Dalton Kelly, it's all right. So yeah, your authorization doesn't like expire after 2 years or 3 years, but generally speaking, when you seek authorization to do the projects, it's more so this timeline about reasonable expectation to spend. Ultimately, over time, costs go up and you don't want to push those parameters. Also, the community said we want these, so you'll probably issue in 2 to 3 years. It's really, do we seek the authorization right now, knowing that there will be some phasing that we're thinking through, but we want to get the authorization, know what our plan is, have it in place? Or do we want to move forward with kind of the 2 projects right now, and then in 2 to 3 or 4 years or 5, seek authorization separately? It's really what it comes down to, but the authorization's good for a while. It's just more likely you would issue it right away.
Yeah.
And you have to spend within 3 years 85% of the proceeds, so that's why we would phase it.
Got it. So if it went longer periods of time, so it could, in theory, we could have, this could go the way of Northwest Rail.
No. I like my job. We would not be waiting that long.
I will say, it's rare that we see authorizations sit out that long, and normally, you know, I think, like, we're having this conversation for another community right now where, like, open space authorization honestly is the most common when we see it sit, and that's because you get the debt authorization to, you know, purchase property to convert to open space, but you don't necessarily know what that property is going to be. You might know one property up front and you're pursuing some others, but, you know, property purchases take a long time, and sometimes it does take 10 years to get to a settlement with, typically in like a general obligation bond space, particularly when we're talking about property taxes, we don't see that authorization sitting and unused for that long of a period of time outside of like a city and county of Denver who's asking for $900 million of authorization, and so their phasing is just a longer period of time, similar to these school districts, right, where it's just going to take them a longer time because it's larger dollar amounts, big projects, lots of projects. That takes time. Otherwise, in the property tax space, usually it's like, you know, you're authorizing, you're probably issuing within the first year to start projects. If you are phasing slightly, then it's probably 2 or 3 years later. Not that you have to, that's just typically how we see it play out.
I have a question.
Yes.
And when does the repayment start then? If we once we start spending, then the repayment is
Yeah, so
expected.
you have the authorization to start levying the mill levy for it essentially immediately. So if you pass in November, you can certify that mill in December to start collecting that following year in 2026. If you think you're going to issue in 2026, then we would recommend you do that, right? So that we can then start payments in 2026, which also allows us, sometimes you can have like a larger principal amortization the first year, which helps saves on interest, right? There's some structuring things that we do to accommodate that, to make sure that those taxpayers are being put to use immediately. And then essentially you cannot levy mills so long once the debt is paid off and that authorization's gone, your ability to levy that mill is also gone, similar to what's going to happen to your outstanding general obligation bonds after next year when you make the final payment on those.
Any other questions? Any other thoughts as far as what we'd like to do? So if we push this to our first meeting in July, which would be, I guess, Tuesday. And at that point in time, since we're not looking at consensus, but we can actually take a vote, then we can move it along that way.
Yeah, what I would anticipate, if you're open to it, Mayor Pro Tem, is bring the 2 ballot question languages, similar to what we had here. We broke out into 2 questions, but I do hear consensus on 1 question, so it would just be, 1 question with the 2 projects, 1 question with other projects, so you guys could see numbers. We can also kind of rerun the numbers as well, because with just doing the service center and the BBRC, we wouldn't stagger debt issuance timing. We would just do 1 20-year bond, so it changes the math a little bit, so we could be prepared to bring that forward.
Okay.
So basically, what we'd be choosing between is increasing, debt increase by 74 million with the repayment cost not to exceed 120 million, or debt increase by 40 million with the repayment cost not to exceed 70 million. So the first one has the 3, the second one has the 2.
And from a tax impact perspective, just based on the numbers you've seen so far, that's, essentially if it's 296 for all 3, for the average home value, drops to about 160 for the 2.
160 increase, $160 increase.
Okay. Okay.
So you guys
Yeah.
can note on that. You can read through the packet materials that'll be published on Thursday. We might be adding some last minute stuff if that's okay with you since of the timing. But so that would be the plan, and it would be a vote to move forward with a resolution then to
Right.
set the ballot language. So it still would be a few more steps after that.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to the second item, financial update.
Thank you. We will switch around some
Transition.
staffing real quick. Yeah, I had Sarah, Morgan, Jack, and the name tags are over that way. Just gonna leave that there for now. I'm not gonna do that.
We're good.
Dear no.
So that happened really be with you story.
Yeah, I think that's where everybody is.
How we doing?
Ready.
You ready?
Are we all ready? Yes.
All right. Who am I turning it over to?
You can turn it over to me this
All
time
right.
to begin the update.
Go
So,
ahead.
thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. We're excited here tonight to start kind of the kickoff of our 2026 budget process. I'm here joined tonight with Interim Chief Financial Officers Sarah Kalsa and Morgan Walton, and Public Works Director Jeff Arthur. The agenda tonight is we kind of want to start really high level, as we discussed in the last meeting, kind of around this economic uncertainty that we're all kind of reading about, feeling, and seeing in real time. So Sarah will give an economic overview both at the kind of national level and then honing into Colorado. Morgan will then kind of zoom even further into our own city financials and how it's very similar to what we're seeing kind of both statewide and nationwide. We'll give a brief update on the utility enterprises since they are a little bit different than kind of those general government revenues and economic factors that we'll be talking about earlier in the night. And then I will wrap it up with sort of next steps as we move forward into full budget season. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
All right. Thank you for having me. Happy to kind of go over an economic overview for everybody. We titled this a time of uncertainty, and I think you guys used the word uncertainty like 10 times already, so it's not going to be a surprise. Basically, before we get into the city finances, we kind of want to take this broader view of the U.S. economy and then focus in on Colorado. Because as a local government, especially when it comes to revenue, a lot of things are out of our control, right? There's a lot of macroeconomic factors that kind of dictate the revenue that we receive. So we use a lot of sources to kind of come up with this data, but I just want to point out that a lot of it comes from the CU Leeds School of Business and their annual economic forecast, as well as the state of Colorado legislative. They do a quarterly forecast. So we'll begin with national concerns, right? You'll see on this slide there's some nice scary headlines that came out after the April tariff policy was announced. And since then, things haven't gotten more certain. Today, Jerome Powell, the Fed chief, talked to Congress and basically said, the economy is on a path of uncertainty, right? And he was really talking about tariffs and what is that going to mean for us. But there's a lot of things going on right now that are giving economists and people, residents just concerned. So other than the tariff, when we talk about the national policies that are kind of concerning, you have the cuts to the federal government, you have disagreements on monetary policies, and just this kind of concern that you have a lot of change from the federal government on what we're doing and when we're doing it and why. And so without having that consistency, businesses have a hard time to know, well, what's coming. In addition to these kind of like federal policy things, you have the U.S. has high levels of debt, and there are concerns about the weakening U.S. dollar, and what will that mean for that? The U.S. has been really lucky that we've had a strong dollar, and this has kind of allowed us to borrow money at really reasonable and terms that are good for us. And so if people have less space worldwide in the dollar, it might impact our ability to kind of keep on refinancing the debt we have and might have a major impact. Of course, there's a lot of global conflicts right now, right? And there's concerns about what does that mean for the economy. The Israel and Iran conflict, there's concerns, what does that mean for oil prices and what is that going to do, kind of the domino effect there. There's a lot of concerns. There's a decline in consumer and business sentiment, right? That's kind of what we talked about. There's been a lot of volatility in the stock market. So look at this graph shows U.S. real GDP. Well, you can kind of see that since 2015, the U.S. economy has been on this nice path of growth. Economists think if we're kind of growing at 2 to 3% a year, that's good growth. And outside that little COVID dip that came right back up, that's what we've been doing. And so, for example, you can see in quarter 4, we grew by 2.5%. So that's like good, healthy growth. What I like about this slide is this comes from the Leeds School of Business, is they took a lot of different forecasts and kind of put them together and basically grouped them to optimistic and pessimistic. And I think that the thing that concerns me is when you see the optimistic line, it's just above trend line, right? So even people who are saying, hey, we're okay, basically are saying, we're going to grow in the way that we've grown. And the people who are pessimistic are saying, yeah, we might have a recession or a big downturn coming. So this shows GDP growth by quarter. The most recent data we have is from quarter 1, 2025. You might have read in the news that this was actually negative GDP growth. So this is preliminary number. When it's finalized, it's very possible that it might be slightly positive. What we do know for certain is it's well below the trend, right? We've been growing at a 2+% kind of rate, and this is actually negative. So I'll also say that while a negative GDP growth is never a positive thing, economists are also kind of warning, don't overreact to this number. Because a big reason why this is negative is because in quarter 1, businesses imported a ton. Because of all the tariff concerns, all these things that are going, they basically brought in a lot of goods to this country, and this metric is saying how much as a nation are we producing. So when we import something, it's actually like a negative to that number. So basically they're saying it's not a good sign, but it's also not something to overreact to. This next slide shows national consumer sentiment. It's a University of Michigan survey they've been doing for a long time. It's kind of one of the industry standards. People really rely on economists. So the first kind of line chart shows just general consumer sentiment. And you can see that it has declined kind of rapidly. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thanks. Forgive me, this terminology is interesting to me, like sentiment. Can we define that?
Yeah.
There was,
So
it
it's
was
like-
on another slide.
Like, how do you feel about the economy, essentially? Like asking people, do you feel good? Do you think the economy is going to go to a positive place? Do you think it's going to go negative? Are you concerned about the economy? What's your general sentiment?
Okay.
And so it's like, if it's above line, people are feeling good and positive about where the economy is and where it's going. And when it's below, it's like, we have concerns.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, you can see it's declined, right? It's declined the last 5 months. And, this table only goes back to 2000, but it's basically as low as it's been. The other line chart shows like, well, how do you feel, asking people, what do you feel about inflation? Do you think inflation is going to be an issue? Do you think it's going to go up? Are you worried about it? Not surprisingly, people were very concerned about inflation when inflation was high, right? And as inflation kind of went down nationally, the fears went down. And then you see this huge spike in May. And that's essentially after the tariffs were announced. I think I read this is the highest it's been since 1981 when the US economy was dealing with some major inflation issues. So while this is just a survey, right, it's not a direct economic indicator, what it is important is what people feel like is important for the economy, right? If everyone is concerned about where things are going, you're going to make personal decisions which you think is the best interest for yourself and your family, which might include spending less money. And if you spend less money, that is going to have a direct impact on the economy. So this graph shows the stock market year to date in 2025. It shows three kind of major indexes, the Dow Jones, the SP 500, the NASDAQ. As you can kind of see, all three are basically where they started at the beginning of the year. Some are a tiny bit down, tiny bit up. Why I find this slide interesting is, the stock market isn't necessarily the greatest indicator of the US economy. It does show you the volatility that we're in, right? It's been a wild ride, some highs and some lows. And even though it's kind of where it started, if you look back traditionally, historically about how the stock market's been recently, it's been increasing pretty rapidly, right? So the fact that we're 6 months into the year and we don't have growth, then itself is a pretty major change in what we've seen, since basically the Great Recession. So finally, for the US economy, JP Morgan does this graphic that's basically saying what's the chances that they think the US economy might hit a recession in the near future. They take a super massive complex economic model and kind of filter it down to something that's easily digestible. So right now they're saying they view a 40% chance of a recession. This is actually down from 60% last month, so that's good. The other thing I kind of like about this is it shows not just chance of recession, but also just like overall, what do they think is going to lead in the future? So they're saying they just think there's a 15% chance of strong growth in the near future. And a 15% chance of like, Goldilocks, okay growth, that's okay, we're fine. Not too hot, not too cold, right? And they're saying there's a 70% chance that either we're going to have subpar growth as a nation or even a recession. So, that's not great. So we're going to switch to Colorado. Basically, so like kind of the overview of the US, right, that we've had pretty good growth up until through 2024, and then 2025 has been an interesting year where we're not in a recession yet. Yes?
Sorry, before we go into the
Yeah.
Colorado
Yeah.
economic overview, looking at the compartmentalization of changes at the federal level versus the state level and then the municipal level, for individuals and for businesses and for municipalities, they don't all function the same way. So if we are looking at the federal level, there are cycles it goes through, and there's a great deal of influence. That's why I'm glad you told me what sentiment is. I mean, that's influenced heavily by what people think and feel. For a municipality, there are some certain, I mean, there's, the think and feel piece is not as big of an influence on how we fluctuate over time. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. It can depend, right? Like ultimately, we don't have a Lafayette survey, right? So we don't know if Lafayette residents feel a little bit more positive about the economy. But it is true, right, that just because the US is here doesn't mean Lafayette is going to necessarily follow, right? They're connected and yet they're also different, if that's what, if I'm
Yes,
correcting it
and
right.
we do, I'm just trying to understand that we do have some influence over how people feel about the economy locally.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? Like ultimately, if, like you think about, Boulder, right? Boulder has a lot of federal contracts, just an example. So if they're cutting a lot of federal jobs, that can impact some of our residents, right? And it has nothing to do with us, and that's a federal level kind of decision. On the other hand, some global economy things though, like if there is a conflict in the Middle East and that's making businesses feel uncomfortable on the global level about international trade and what that impact might be, that might not impact directly Lafayette residents, right? So it's kind of hard to connect the dots, if that makes sense. Some things really
Absolutely.
do and some things don't.
And thank you for going
Yeah.
with me on that. So I'm trying to put, like, the resilience is literally written up there.
Yeah.
And water is an overarching piece. These are some of the ways I'm trying to make sure I view the forcings on our individual world. And yeah, there's global influences, there are federal influences, there are state influences, and we still have to consider the whole portfolio of what we have available. So we're not fit as our success is not, I don't think our success is as fickle as at the federal level. Like, there's going to be a lot of variation more at the federal level, and I don't know if that's a fair.
Yeah, and I think we agree. That's why I think we built this presentation that way, right? It's kind of like, hey, we're going to start nationally, big picture, somewhat connected to us. Some things maybe not be, but it's good to kind of know that, like, you got to keep your eye on this as well. Filter it down to Colorado, because once again, just because Colorado is doing something doesn't mean necessarily our local community is impacted by it, but it's more likely than not, right, compared to the federal. And then we get into kind of our city finances and what's going on with us.
And we can mitigate that some.
Yeah.
Okay.
Certain
Thank you.
levels, yeah. So Colorado, basically the federal was, like a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns, things are still figuring out. For Colorado, I think the story that's what we want to kind of show and what economists are kind of seeing is Colorado's had this incredible period of growth, right? The last 10, 15 years, Colorado's economy has grown as fast as any state in the country. Tons of people moving here, tons of things being built, tons of growth. We're talking about over 5% a year on average. So what economists are kind of seeing in 23 and 24 is that growth is slowing. And to be clear, it's not that we're in a negative, it's not that we're in a recession, it's not that we're in bad times, it's just a stabilization is what we like to kind of call it, right? Like, we're going to talk about home prices in a second, right? But it might not be really sustainable for home prices to keep on increasing at the level they've been. So, for them to actually slow down might be something good in the long term. But to your point, a lot of our revenue comes from property taxes, right? So that's going to impact the revenue we have as a city. So kind of want to show this Colorado story that, we're seeing maybe a change in how the economy is going. And since, a big part of what our finances are impacted by property and sales tax, we're going to kind of focus on home prices and retail sales. And we'll start with home prices. So this slide comes from the Leeds School of Business and basically is looking at the change in home prices over the last 15 years from 2009 to 24. You can see Colorado's the sixth highest. That sounds great. What was interesting when this presentation was given is they said if you went back last year and you looked at 08 to 23, we were number one. So Colorado's gone from 1 to 6 in a single year. And that's because you can see here is 2024 growth, right? So if we just isolate last year and say, hey, year over year home prices, us compared to the rest of the nation, how are we doing? We're actually the fourth slowest growth. To be clear, you can see that's still growth, right? It's still just under 4%. It's still solid growth, but it's just meaning, we've gone so far ahead of the rest of the nation, now it's kind of slowing down. Once again, this isn't a bad thing for the Colorado economy that like people can maybe afford homes and there's a lot of positives. But for a local government who, receives property taxes, what it means is, hey, our revenue might be stabilizing, and we might not be seeing, we're gonna get into reassessment years, and basically Boulder County reassesses every 2 years. On average, it begin over double-digit growth when they do that, right? And so we might not be seeing that anymore. And our preliminaries you saw is 4% from the county for next year, is it's just and so it's just kind of a change, right? It's a stabilization of growth. Moving on to sales tax. So you can kind of see for Colorado, if you look at from 2010 to 2020, it was pretty consistent, right? You had basically every year 5% increase in sales tax. That's fantastic growth, really stable. And then COVID hit, right? In COVID, none of us can go on vacations. We're all stuck on home. We all had to isolate, and not just in Colorado, but also Lafayette and the whole nation. What do people do? They spend a lot of money, right? So sales tax ballooned everywhere. And that's what we saw here as well. And then basically in the last 2 years, we've seen a real flattening, where it's either a small increase or decrease. So what you see in that table is Colorado retail sales percent change. You see the kind of big COVID bump. Then you see the 23 and 24, which is 1% and slightly negative. And so the Colorado Legislative Council, they actually forecast out. And so what they're saying is, we kind of see 25 and 26, that same really slim growth, right? 1%, under 2%. And then they're hoping in 27, that's we kind of get back to this 5% trend. Obviously, that's pretty far out, but at least that's an optimistic look at it. So this slide basically looks at taxable sales for the 30 largest cities in Colorado. I want to kind of put a qualifier on this. Just want to make sure this is looking at taxable sales from the Department of Colorado. This is not what we received in sales tax. So this is basically showing a negative 2% for Lafayette. We did not see that much of a decline in sales tax. It's just basically, it's a similar metric, but it's not the same. So I just want to put that kind of qualifier out. We wanted to put it out there because we think it's important to just kind of show the community and the council that, when you compare the 30 largest cities, Lafayette was the third lowest. But if you look, basically any larger community and a lot of our neighbors, they're all under 2%, right? So it's this whole state is kind of seeing the slowing. And when you get to this small to local level, like you're going to have impacts of, hey, this new store opened or this store moved or these types of things. But it just kind of reinforcing this overall trend of, hey, as a state, we're seeing kind of a shift. So these are just some additional metrics for the state of Colorado. GDP growth, employment growth, population growth, personal income growth, labor force participation growth, and home price, which we already talked about. And once again, just showing, hey, as a state, if you look at our 15-year rank, 09 to 24, we're top 7, great. Once again, if you go back to 08 to 23, we were top 3 in all of these categories. Why? Because you see the 24 ranks, right? It's not that things are decreasing. It's just that our growth is kind of slowing down compared to other states. And once again, it's not necessarily a terrible thing. It just can be seen as like, hey, us as a state is kind of stabilizing in our growth. And it just might be somewhat of a new reality that we have to factor in when we're thinking about revenues and projecting out into the future. So kind of just in summary, tying this all together, to be clear, we're not in a recession right now on the federal level, the state level, our local economy, right? We're not coming here raising the alarm that things are awful and we need to do drastic things today. There's still things that are showing that, hey, we're growing, we're just growing slow. That said, there's a lot of clouds on the horizon, right? That's what we're seeing, especially on the national level. And I think if you talk to a lot of economists, it's kind of like saying, well, we don't know if those clouds are going to be this major hailstorm that's this terrible storm that destroys everything, or maybe it's a light rain. It's too early to tell, but we better pay attention to those clouds and make sure we're prepared, right? So in addition to this whole kind of uncertainty in the general economy, there's also this story of like, hey, in Colorado, times are changing, and we're kind of in this period of slower growth that's stabilizing. Ultimately, I think forecasters have a pretty difficult job. Their job is kind of predict the unpredictable. And if you talk to any of them or you read reports, they'll say this is one of the most difficult times they've ever been in, because it's not that these economic indicators are showing anything terrible now, but there's also these other things that are concerning. So where is this going to lead to? And the point being, as a city, we don't know either, right? So what we can do is take this information, monitor it, be smart, be fiscally responsible, and make sure we're making decisions that are in the interest of our residents. And that's what we're trying to do. So with that, I'll pause for any questions.
Sorry, I've asked a lot already. Does anybody else need to?
Go ahead, looks like you got.
I just have quite the dotted lines. I keep seeing them bump up, like on the very first slide and on the very last one, actually. There's a set of bumps, and this one,
Yeah.
I think it was the very last slide. There's a little the dotted lines,
Yeah.
24 to 26, and on the first one from the federal, the federal level slide, there's a bump. The pessimistic one bumps up that. So, is that something that is inherent in the system that has to go back up? Because, I mean, if we're looking at trends, it looks like there could be like a depression coming, but there's a bump. What's the trigger for the pessimistic bump, I guess?
For you saying that why the decrease?
No, they increase.
Pessimistic.
Why does it go back up? Is that just
Oh.
something we would
Like a-
expect because it naturally
Yeah, I
has
mean,
to?
that's kind of the tradition of, it's very rare that you go through something like the Great Depression, right?
Right.
Like it's pretty, most recessions are, 2 or 3 years,
Uh-huh.
and they kind of come up. Like even the Great Recession of 2008, it's just kind of standard that things normalize.
Okay,
right?
so
That
that's
we kind
kind
of
of-
figured it out. Yeah,
That's part of the resilience of the system.
yeah.
Yeah,
Both systems, it looks like.
you'll
Okay.
notice the pessimist, though, when it comes back up, right, it's at that level that it was pre-recession, so it's
Yeah.
not like it goes
Oh, no,
back
no.
up, it just, it
doesn't
stabilizes
keep
back
going
to
down.
the, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Because of smart federal monetary policy, potentially, right? You change how you borrow money and then it juices the economy and then you get out of it, right? So it's not that it just goes up because we make decisions to try to push it up
Okay.
in response,
Yeah, and it was down,
hopefully.
but it doesn't stay down.
It depends who's at the helm of the monetary policy. It could keep going down if they make bad decisions or but
Like I said, if you look at traditionally, it's pretty common if you see recessions and you think about even 2008, right? We had a systematic issue with our housing market that led to a lot of other problems. And even with something like that, most things were able to kind of work itself out. To Katie's point, if we go back and look at it, here's our trend, here's a down, it goes back up, but doesn't catch up to the old trend, right? Like, so times get good again, but a lot of times you don't catch what kind of you lost, right? Like if we're going at 3% every year and what that would have been, it's not that you have that huge bump, but like things normalize, they stabilized again, traditionally.
All right, so I'll be going over the city's financial overview. So just to start us off, I wanted to go over a little bit of the differences in the types of city revenues that we're seeing across the board. So what really drives our general fund is those economically driven revenues. So that's the sales and use tax, property, fees. And then on the obverse side of that, we have the enterprise funds. And those are really driven by usage. So those are charges for services. So looking a little bit deeper into sales and use tax, if we're talking about $1 being collected in sales tax, how is that broken out? Approximately 44 cents of that is going to the city of Lafayette, 34 cents to our general fund, and then the remainder split out between the other dedicated funds. 33 cents of that dollar is going to the state, 11 cents is going to Boulder County, and another 11 cents is going to RTD, and 1 cent is going to SCFD. So looking at the city's sales and use tax performance for 2024, approximately 45% of general government revenue came from these sales and use taxes, which totaled about $27.4 million in 2024. That's up about 0.6% compared to 2023. And we did notice the impact of the King Soopers revenue sharing agreement here, and also a decrease in building use tax, leading to kind of a net cumulative of that 0.6% increase. And really what we are showing between 2023 and 2024 is very similar on the graph that we had seen a little bit earlier, that sales and use tax remain relatively flat throughout the state of Colorado. So we see that as well in our city. So looking forward into 2025 and 2026, also somewhat mirroring the state, we are thinking that these will remain relatively flat or perhaps have a small growth, but we're not anticipating large growth at this time in these areas. Moving on to the property tax, again, kind of wanted to walk through what a theoretical dollar of property tax looks like between the different breakouts. So about 53 cents of that is going to the Boulder Valley School District, 27 cents of that is going to Boulder County, 18 cents is coming here to the city of Lafayette, and the breakout for the different areas that serves is off to the right. There's also a cent for northern water and a cent for urban drainage and flood. So looking at our property tax, approximately 25% of our general government revenue in 2024 came from those property taxes. And since 2024 was a reassessment year, we've talked a little bit previously in this presentation, our revenues were up about 25% from 2023, leading to $15.2 million in 2024. We do have some preliminary data from Boulder County. They're still working through. It's obviously not final. We're seeing around a 4% increase in 2024. It is a non-assessment year in 2025, so we are anticipating very minimal growth in this coming year. But with 2026, even though the increase amount is positive, it is lower than the amounts that we've seen during previous assessment years, as shown in the little graph or the little table at the bottom. Moving to fees for services, this is approximately 11% of our general government revenue. It's about $7 million in 2024, up 0.6% compared to 2023. Revenue from recreation fees have really stabilized since the COVID pandemic, but we saw a decrease in 2024 of building licenses and permits still being down. So looking ahead to 2025 and 2026, we'll talk further on the next slide, but we are looking to implement a parks, rec, and golf fee study, as well as accompanying that with some fee updates that we'd be bringing forward to council. And we also are looking for improvements in licensing and permit process in years going forward. So taking a look at the Parks, Rec, and Fee study, really the trends related to recreation are changing. So the city has engaged a consultant to review the current parks, rec, and golf fee structure. The goal of this study is to provide an analysis and be able to support cost recovery that we could bring forward to council. It will also result in a fee study that can be used to update future fees as we move to the future with those. And then any recommended fee updates would be presented as part of the budget process and would go into effect January 1st, 2026. So as part of this discussion, as we start to look at the recreation fee updates, a point was brought up about a larger discussion about the city's current fee structure. So staff is proposing an update to the current fee structure and looking for feedback from council on this. We're looking to provide clarity about where the fees are established, how they're updated, and then who approves those fees. So the charter, as you can see here, generally tasks fees for approval to council for anything related to public peace and health and safety of persons and property. So because of this, what we would recommend is keeping the council approval for any fees related to public peace, health, and safety. So we have those items listed above on the slide underneath the blue section. However, there are other fees throughout the city that are related to city operations, and staff are proposing that these would be updated and approved by city management as they are related to costs and provide services, as related to the costs to provide services as well as administrative costs. So the proposed items we have there are under the purple banner, and really the goal of this would be to establish an ordinance that would be brought in front of council to provide clarity of the process and authority moving forward. So I will pause there for questions and feedback from council, and I'm happy to bring that previous slide forward if that's easier to review.
Questions?
What does the current code say regarding those fees? Where you can just give me the section and I'll read it.
Sure, I believe the section is listed on there for the charter, and I believe.
6.9.
Yeah,
So that's actually what City Council's tasked with. The fee section actually stipulates that it is all fees, all 250, but we've been very inconsistent in what we've been bringing forward. And part of the challenge, especially as you look at some of like the recreation fees, when we adopt the budget in October, that has some of these fees, they've already published their catalog for that January session. And so I know that they've always been challenged with kind of the timing piece. So because we've been inconsistent about it and because staff haven't been quite sure like what goes to council and can we just automatically update based upon CPI. We just wanted to provide a little bit more clarity, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be all of those, but we just thought we could bring something forward to council that you guys know what role you had in some of these things that are definitely more of the like public safety and the utility piece, the things that affect all residents in the community versus the pieces that may be applicable to more of a specified user. And so, again, don't have to decide tonight. It would be something we would have ongoing conversations, especially in August about it. But if council is supportive, we'll continue exploring what maybe the best practice is moving forward.
Yes.
Could you go back one more slide? Yeah, perfect. The way I'm reading that is we, and I don't think this is true, so I'm asking the question because I want you to tell me no. Saying that determine current cost recovery levels, does that mean right now we don't know that it's meeting our cost recovery levels, or that we know that we need to update it because times have changed and at one point it did and now it doesn't?
Yeah, so we don't exactly have a common cost recovery model for it, and especially post-COVID, general fund has been subsidizing more heavily, and so while we know generally kind of how much each program might be subsidized, we've had a one-size-fits-all cost recovery model, and what is more typical in communities is you sort of look at the programs and you look at programs that are more community-focused, right? Your Learn to Swim ones versus your private, personal training class, right? And if we're subsidizing in the same way, that might not be the direction we want to go. So we just want to bring it forward to council to say, should the user of the personal training pay 100% of the costs, and therefore we could subsidize Learn to Swim classes, at 50% instead of our typical 70, like kind of those conversations. And so while we have it right now, I think it's probably fairly outdated and maybe not aligned with how we would like our community to benefit from certain programs.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did you?
Councilor Barnes.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. In the past, we've had fee studies, and they have informed decisions in moving forward. In this situation, because we haven't done the fee study yet for the golf course and what's the other one?
General rec and senior service programs.
Yeah, since we haven't done that study, it's not really clear what the impact will be to the financial situation of the city, because we haven't finished that. But if that were through ordinance, something that the city manager managed, then I'm guessing that would provide for efficiencies in operation. Is that one of the things it would provide for? And do you have a sense of what we'll see once we do the fee study? And I'm asking the crystal ball over there.
Yeah, I mean, I think and I'll let Director Heisel, if I misspeak, she's much more involved in the, actual fee study, but I think we are probably going to see a few things. I think we might see some programs that are being underutilized, and so I think we might see opportunities to phase out programs that have high cost, low attendance kind of things. I think we're going to see programs that we, again, to that like personal individualized ones that we're subsidizing where we might not want to be. And so it's hard to say that overall, like we're going to see X number percent increase overall. I think you're going to see some increase and maybe even some decrease, and it all levels out. But that's sort of the exploration where we kicked off about a month ago with our consultants. And so right now they're heavily in the data finding study, but we will be coming back to council before we really update the numbers to talk philosophy and then apply that philosophy to those actual numbers. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, let's move on.
All right, home stretch. So we have a utility rate study underway. We'll talk more about it through the budget process, but we're going to take a few minutes tonight just to kind of talk about what we're initially seeing with that in terms of revenues and expenditures and things we'll need to talk about to bring those two into alignment. So we often talk about the three utility enterprises separate from everything else because there's a few quirky things about them that make them track a little different than other services. So they fall under Tabor, so a lot of rules around revenues and expenditures. They're heavily regulated, so we don't really have a lot of choices about what services or the level of service we provide. It's largely driven by EPA through state health department. Often huge dollars. We charge less than a penny a gallon for water, but it goes toward projects and infrastructure that's in the billions. It takes a really long time to build projects, but they also last a really long time. Baseline Reservoir was built in the early 1900s. We have water rights. Baseline Reservoir is early 1900s, water rights from the 1800s. So if we take care of things, they last a really long time. So that sort of fits into our strategy. The economy doesn't really influence water use. People use about the same amount of water indoors either way. What really tends to drive it, particularly in a community where like 80% of our use in the summer is outdoors, is the weather, which makes it a really different model in terms of how we predict things going forward. This is just a national graph of people's typical water, sewer, trash bills across the country. You can see that we are not unique in that our costs have continued to go up. And that has a lot to do with aging infrastructure, cost of materials, construction, it's capital intensive. And so we are not unique in that. This is a graph of our revenues from 2020 to 2025. So on this, the blue is water, green is water reclamation, orange is stormwater. Water is the biggest fund by quite a bit, and similarly, when you get your monthly bill, it's the biggest chunk of your bill. So a couple things of note on this. If you look at the green and the orange, those are sort of trending with the rate increases we've had over the past few years. Those are going up. But if you look at water, it sort of zigs and zags. So if you look at 2023 to 2022, we had a rate increase, but the revenues dropped because we had a wet year, and then last year was a particularly dry year, and people used a ton of water, and we had a lot of revenue. And so as we look at trying to fund projects and set rates, we have to factor in how the weather and how the climate is trending, because it has such a huge impact on use. So some observations so far as we've gotten into looking at data with our consultant. Even with the rate increases we've seen, we have not seen obvious trends in people reducing their outdoor use. We also, interestingly, haven't seen we made some changes a few years ago to kind of protect the lowest rate tiers and increase the upper rate tiers, and we have not seen a big migration out of the upper rate tiers. So that would seem to indicate that if people really want their lawn green, they're willing to pay for it. I guess the good news is that by people doing that, they're paying closer to the full cost of what that peak water demand costs the city, and that helps better manage the costs for essential indoor use and some of our vulnerable users. Another thing we've been looking at is delinquency rates and just seeing how things are trending with shutoffs with the increases. It does look like there's an upward trend in that. So we're digging into that to try to understand what's going on with that, who's being impacted, and hopefully come back with some ideas on what interventions we might need, whether it's with the rate structure or programs, to make sure we're protecting our most vulnerable customers. Another thing that we have implemented in the last couple of years was adjusting our raw water rate. So we have a couple of city facilities that they're using our source water supplies, but they have diversions ahead of the treatment plant. We have realigned those rates to be closer to what the actual cost is. And some of the benefit of that is on a hot summer day, we're delivering about 800,000 gallons of water to the golf course. And you sort of think about how many gallons per round of golf that is. We want to make sure that people that are taking advantage of that service are covering that cost, and it's not being passed along to our other customers. I'm going to shift to cash in lieu of water dedication. This is another area where council made some changes to bring the charges we assess to new growth more in line with our actual cost of water. I did just want to flag with this, when council did that, we put a provision in so that folks that had existing agreements where fees were locked in, that we would continue that, but we also wrote into that ordinance that if developers come back and amend those agreements, that provision goes away. So we may, as we move forward, need to have some conversations about projects that are changing their scope or changing their units, and whether we want to move forward with assessing current rates. And just to, again, give you a sense of context, so if we hypothetically had a 200-unit single-family residential, and they locked in a rate of $1.89 million in 2019, that water nowadays would cost us closer to $10 million, and that's about half of what we bring in a year to cover that. So, it's a serious consideration of how we want to look at those projects when the opportunities come up, and in a lot of cases, we are seeing those developers come back and they're looking to do something a little different than what they originally proposed. This is just a national and regional construction cost indice. You can see there's a pretty steady upward trend. There was some interesting things that happened during COVID with supply chain and other construction cost escalation. Where this becomes really acutely important with the water utilities is a lot of these projects take decades and decades to move forward, and so those costs continue to change over the life of that. And then we're also currently seeing a lot of uncertainty around tariffs. A lot of our projects require equipment and electronics that have traditionally come from overseas. I'm going to highlight a few things about some of those projects. These are kind of the biggies that are on the radar. All of them have been in the works for decades. The cheap ones are in the tens of millions. The biggest ones are in the billions. A good example is the NISP project. The water rights date back to 1992. This year, we are part of a group, but that group entered into a $100 million legal settlement related to the permitting. So that's just the cost of the settlement. The project itself is in the $2.2 billion range, and we still have a lot of uncertainty about costs and completion. So there's a big uncertainty really with all these projects in terms of when we'll be able to get them completed, when they will deliver water, and how that will impact ultimately what our cost is. Along with that, it remains important that we take care of the assets we have. It is much more expensive to make emergency repairs than it is to do things proactively. Just again, to kind of give context, when we have to go out and fix a broken water main in the middle of the night, it probably works out to in the ballpark of $10,000 a foot. We spend all night and replace one stick of broken pipe. If we have stood up a proactive main replacement program that's getting going this summer, and it's closer to $200 a foot. So if we can get ahead of things and try to shift that dynamic, there's some pain in the short term, but ultimately it will keep us from more serious issues long term. So as we get into the fee study that we are in the midst of, that is including digging deep into our existing billing and revenue data to understand how the previous rate model that Reftel has put together is performing, to see if it's doing what we thought it was going to do. We are digging deeper into the stormwater fund. In previous iterations, we focused more on water and then wastewater, just because those are the biggest areas of concerns. The stormwater is a smaller fund, but they are working with us to help make sure that we are putting enough money aside for preventive maintenance and to make some progress in there. In the water and water reclamation financial plans, we're updating the costs, we're updating the revenue projections. Again, with all of this, there's a lot of uncertainty, and particularly with the utilities, some of the things that have happened at the state level around land use make some of these things less predictable in terms of how our capital needs are going to evolve relative to growth. And then finally, we'll be developing options to meet increased projected revenue needs. So kind of quickly, what's in the toolbox, and we'll be talking about this more at subsequent discussions. On the revenue side, we'll be talking about whether there's options to further refine our rate structure, and again, to try to factor in equity and protect our vulnerable users. I do expect that we're going to need to talk about adjustments to monthly rates and fees, and I would expect a conversation about adjusting development-related costs to make sure that we're comfortable with our cost recovery approach there. And then on the expenditure side, we are anticipating that we're going to have to defer at least some capital projects and some maintenance, just because the gap is large and we can't realistically in the short term close that, but we hope to be strategic about that and not be short-sighted, because there are long-term impacts with deferring things. And finally, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but taking a look at some of our programs and services to see, whether it's water conservation or bill assistance, to make sure that we're getting the best outcomes we have out of those programs, to make sure we're encouraging people to make good decisions and that we're supporting vulnerable customers. So with that, I am going to turn it back to City Manager Dolling, or do you want to pause for questions?
Any questions regarding the water funds? Councilor Brennan?
Thank you so much. That's a lot of detail, and I really appreciate it. You said something about high water users getting close to covering their costs on peak water days. Am I understanding that correctly, that the way that we set it is based on like the average throughout the year? So on like a peak really hot day when somebody might be using a bunch of water, our costs are not really covered, their costs that they're.
So we have a tiered rate structure.
Right.
And so basically what that means is, based on your meter size, you get a certain allocation of water at each price tier.
Yep.
And so we have attempted to set that up such that if you're an efficient indoor user, you're staying in those lower tiers, but if you're someone who's using a very large amount of water, you get into the upper tiers.
Right.
And so how that makes sense is our system and our infrastructure demands are largely driven on those peaks.
Yeah.
So if those folks are only using that water for 2 months a year, but we have to have that infrastructure capacity year-round, charging more for that use helps more equitably distribute the cost of having a 10 million gallon a day water treatment plant that only has to produce like 2 million in the winter.
Right. Let me think of how to phrase my question a little differently. So it sounds like, based on your response right then, that during a peak day when our costs are here, because we're pushing a lot of water out, our rate structure as currently designed, the cost recovery that we have for that day does meet that operating expense for that peak day.
Sort of. It's really more that it's more equitably distributing the capital cost of needing infrastructure year-round to support that peak day. So like on that peak day, it's not that we're using that much more electricity or we're using that much more chemical or whatever. It's more that we have to have enough water rights, enough pipe capacity, enough treatment plant capacity, that on those peak days that
We're fine.
the system
Yeah.
doesn't fail.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so basically rather than those costs being just spread evenly,
Sure.
that we're the folks that are sort of driving up that peak disproportionately are paying a disproportionate amount to more equitably distribute the cost and to hopefully keep it more affordable for people who are just trying to take care of basic indoor needs.
Yep. So, I understand now. Thank you. My other question too for you is, you said like past contracts that we have or past agreements, if they were to change, then we have the chance to renegotiate them. Do we have a chance to renegotiate them if we look back at them and say, you're paying $2 million for water rights, but it's going to cost us $8 million?
So the way the ordinance was written, or the resolution was written when it changed, it just said if they're altered or amended. But again, in a lot of cases, these are projects that were approved like 2019. And in a lot of cases, the developers are coming back
They
and they
need- they
want to
need
do a
to,
different
yeah.
number of units or they want to do a different mix.
Yeah.
And so the way it's written, we have the
have the
opportunity
ability.
to revisit that. And those will likely be difficult conversations, but there would also be difficult conversations for the rest of our ratepayers if we don't have them.
Right. Thank you very much.
So then just to clarify, I just want to piggyback on that. So for example, if we had a development that changed and removed commercial, where we anticipated more commercial, that potentially could have,
It's written broadly. It basically says that we'll stick with the agreement, but if the agreement gets
Significantly
altered or
changed.
amended, that, that we left ourselves in a position to revisit it.
good, okay.
Yeah, so it's a policy decision we want to continue to have with city council and obviously with our legal team here as well to kind of better understand what change meant in that instance. But we feel like at least there was some flexibility to allow for these kind of future proofing of, you know, we know that it was undercharged for so long.
I mean,
so
and it's
think something-
particularly the ones, these are cases where we locked in the dollar amount but didn't actually get the money.
Right.
Because if we'd gotten the money at the time, we could have gone and bought water
At that
or
point
near
in time.
close to that rate, but we locked in the cash in lieu, but we didn't get the money, so we didn't buy the water, and so now to buy the water now, it's not enough
Yeah.
money to go to the market and cover those costs.
And currently, there's not a preference on cash and loot, right? We're not,
So currently, I believe it's less than 10 acre feet we can do at the staff level, so small projects so that we don't have to go through that. But anything bigger than that, they have to bring water or they have to come to council and get council to determine that it is in the city's best interest to accept cash in lieu.
okay, great. Did you guys
Oh,
want to say?
thank you. I just had the strategic upgrades of systems that could fail. I know that's an ongoing process, and we've been doing that for years. If there's an opportunity to make our system more robust, we've been doing so. So I appreciate that. That's not a new thing. It's been going on for a long period of time, and hopefully we'll get rid of all the very interesting old things that we find. Eventually, we'll find them all, and they'll all be gone. Fingers crossed. I was wondering if there were any surprises. Have you seen anything that kind of surprised you?
Yeah, no, lots of surprises. And I kind of went fast because I know we're a little over time already, but there's some on the slides. I mean, Willoughby Corner went to hook into our sewer system and the pipe was basically gone. And we have no idea if that's representative of a broader section of our system that could fail catastrophically. So we are increasing our investment in getting out and doing inspection and trying to proactively manage that. South Boulder Road, the plans didn't show an asbestos pipe, but it was an asbestos pipe, and that was $2.2 million to replace that. Willoughby was about somewhere in the $600,000-$700,000 range. So we continue to find things, and you know, almost on a weekly basis, we have a water line let us know that it has reached the end of its useful life in often dramatic ways. So, and it's not totally unique to Lafayette. You know, a lot of infrastructure in this country was built in certain eras, and a lot of it's hitting the end of its useful life, and it's really making sure we're trying to ideally move even from proactive to predictive, to be able to understand, based on the history of what's broken, what's likely to go next, and to try to get in just in time instead of just in case.
That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Moving on.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to kind of talk about moving forward. Again, this is our first step at mini conversation. So kind of to summarize the entire presentation, right? We've made a lot of investments in sort of our foundational core services, right? We've done a lot of strategic plans. We've hired a lot of professional staff, like in contracting or sales tax audits, right? And so we really anticipate that those kind of mass ads have, similar to our economy, also slowed down to a more stabilized rate. And yet we know, based upon even our earlier conversation, that large capital needs, whether it's on the utility side or whether on our general government operations, are continuing to be a conversation that we need to address, including not only major capital projects, but also investing in a more, again, similar to the utilities, a more kind of asset management program so that we can continually invest in our facilities so that we can extend both the life, but also plan for when they do reach kind of their critical lifespan.
early 25 data shows revenues tracking closely with budget, which is good because there has been a lot of uncertainty. So we will continue to monitor this month over month, and again, bring back in August, council a more kind of bigger picture of where we see not only this year ending up, but where we want to head for 2026, which means kind of looking forward. We're going to continue to be efficient and creative in its uses. We've brought forward to council over the last several years kind of different ways to enhance our revenue, whether that be working through Amazon or getting rid of, different incentives that were costing us money. I think we've really kind of squeezed the juice out of those lemons, so I don't really see any big opportunities for us to make code impacts. So we're, again, in this more, we're going to live within our means and not anticipate significant growth while watching some of these economic indicators. So we have kicked off the internal budget process with our department heads. We're actually meeting with all of them in 2 weeks. Through kind of conversations as we kicked it off, I really tasked our departments to look at really optimizing their existing resources. Budgets inherently always have some extra dollars at the end of the year, so we're really doing a deep analysis to see what consistently has excess and can we repurpose that or can we give that back so that we don't necessarily overflate our budget, right? That's what adjustments are for, that's what emergency reserves are for, so we're really looking heavily at those kind of situations while maintaining our investments in operations. We don't anticipate to cut, but what we are doing is creating for council probably a very flexible budget that has pretty minimal investments with the, if times are good, here's what we might come back and look to add. I always like to do that versus try to approve more, and if it goes bad, cut that, because morale and just, optics wise, that never looks good. So I take a very conservative approach at that. And so that's what you guys should anticipate going into August and then kind of into our budget hearings in October. So with that kind of calendaring out, we are, again, underway for both the operating budget and our capital planning program. The 2024, so you're going to have a little whiplash on what year you're in, but the 2024 annual financial report will be presented in August. This is kind of our annual audit for last year's performance, where we'll dig into more of last year. And then in your workshop in August, we will be talking more specifically of what to look for in your 2026 budget that will then have public hearings held in October per your code. So that wraps up our presentation for tonight. Any lingering questions, we're happy to answer and appreciate your guys' time.
Any questions? All right, thank you. Oh, was there, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand move.
It was slow.
Okay.
So in the ACFR, when we see that, there's reference, I think there's an allude to, or the report alludes to the impact of our credit rating in there. But maybe I'm wrong. Is that?
I don't believe so. It will give kind of an update of what's already been issued. It doesn't necessarily issue a brand new credit rating for the city. It does show where our investments sit and what their credit rating is. So that information possibly would be updated if it had changed from 2023 to 2024.
Has it changed?
I don't believe significantly, no.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions now? All right. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is new ideas. Now, I don't think.
I haven't heard, and I did not have a chance to talk with Mayor Potem.
I haven't heard, but I don't think, I spoke to JD, he didn't hear of anything. Did anybody have any ideas that you wanted to bring forward this month?
I alluded to our boards and commissions sharing, asking us questions at council meetings, and I brought it up in councilor comments, but if there's any feedback, if any of you had feedback on that idea, it would be really helpful. From what I've heard from the liaisons and some of the members of the different boards and commissions, that it's hard for them to understand what council wants if they don't have an opportunity to have a conversation. And if depending on how you feel about this, that they would present questions, not as a whole group, but somebody representing the group could say, this is one of the questions that we would like for councilors to weigh in on. Then they would have some understanding of where we are around certain projects they're working on, something, visions that they have, some ideas that they have? Is it something that council feels is significant? There's a significance to what they're doing relative to what council needs. And then we would respond to them in counselor comments, so they would be able to look on video and see, or maybe they stay in for the entire meeting. And that would provide them with a regular way of sharing with us what they're doing, and for us to give feedback, so that they are not going for an entire year without getting feedback from us.
So would that work? And I'm just trying to, so they would speak during public comment or representative.
Yep.
Kind of toss it out there, and then we close the gap or comment on it during council comments.
Yes. And I'm just wondering what your feedback is, because I alluded to it, but didn't really, wasn't a time where we could actually have I was waiting for a workshop to have some discussion about it.
So I really appreciate it, because I think I hear from, especially, one of our very active groups on SRAB, that they're not fully clear on the communication flow back and forth. So I think I would even be supportive of, do we have some sort of guidance that we give all of them of like, here's how you bring a question to us, or here's how you bring an idea to us, or we're also going to bring something back to you once a year to say like, feedback on your work plan or ideas that we think are most pertinent as you're working on your work plan for the coming year, from our perspective or something. I think that would be really valuable. And I would even say that, maybe it doesn't need to be in public comment either. I mean, that's certainly an avenue that's easy for like things that come up, at their meeting and they just want to go to the next meeting and bring it up. That's great. I think that's a good ad hoc option, but I would say we could even consider additional structure for having communication flows between us and boards. I think that's probably more equitable too, right? Because like somebody might be some group might be more savvy than another in how to do that or the ability to do that, and they might be getting to our meetings more frequently, which is fine. That's sort of their prerogative. But if we have a structure and a clearly identified process, then hopefully it's more equitable and consistent. So somebody who maybe some group that isn't going to speak up as much has that opportunity and understands what the process would be.
Thank you.
Well, and isn't part of the reason that we have liaisons is to collect that feedback from the commissions and boards and then bring it back to council? I mean.
That is, yes,
That's
and
supposed to
it's
be-
not happening. Is what I'm hearing from some of the boards and commissions, is that they don't fully understand like what council as a group feels about work plans or projects that they're doing. And it's.
Is it because they're not communicating to the liaisons that are attending their meetings? Is it because, just kind of trying to probe a little bit to see where the potential breakdown could be?
That's what they're trying to do as well, is determine why they don't hear from council. And it's not in their bylaws, the process. There is no process set up. So that's the question, is like, what do we do?
I think one of the things that I've seen that has improved it is for especially SRAB, right, who does have asks frequently. I'm sitting there and listening, right, and trying to make sure I take note. But if there's something specific that they want me to bring, I make sure to tell them, like, make sure to point it out. If you want me to go and say that, or you have a question that you want me to bring, and really being very explicit of like, tell me what you need. And so I think that has helped. But I think part of the problem, to your question, Brian, is there's just so much information that they're talking about. So like what things do rise to the top?
Mm-hmm.
And my thinking of what rises to the top might be different from their thinking of what rises to the top. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that we do filter it, which we should. Mm-hmm. It's our role to filter it. But sometimes having the unfiltered ask or unfiltered idea or whatever it is, and then allowing us to discuss as a group is also valuable. If that makes sense.
I thought it was last year, I want to say at the retreat, we were talking about each one of the boards and commissions coming to present to us. And because I see a few things that's come up as a result of this, like, it'd be nice to see who's on that and have them be able to ask or say what they're doing. I mean, Historic Preservation Commission is considering making a recommendation on an amendment to a code change. I am but one person as the liaison. I cannot speak on behalf of all of council. So I can support them and say, yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for you to bring it to council. But again, how, as you all have pointed out, there needs to be some sort of, I think it would be nice to have some sort of way, a process outlined. And it doesn't have to be formally in the code, but maybe it's in the council handbooks or something that talks about how they might come. Because right now, they don't have times where they're scheduled to come in and say, hey, we're giving a 5-10-minute presentation or whatever. And they can't, if they've got questions, just say, I'm going to call up on the red phone and ask for my time. They need to be able to have at least some guidance, some standard operating procedure.
Could I maybe offer as a next step? It sounds like there's a few people within our boards who are already appointed that might have good ideas and help us design a process. Maybe we make a request or maybe we sort of tap people that we think would be good at this, because maybe we'll get a lot of people that will be wanting to work on this, but 3 or 4 people from across the boards, ask them to get together once or twice and bring a process or an idea of a process to us for our consideration. Does that, just an idea of where to go from here to try to get this to a.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a good idea for them to kind of come forward with an idea. I think that in itself, asking them to kind of do, I mean, kind of.
Tell us what you need.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if.
I would like to hear from the other counselors as well.
So I do think it's a great idea. I thought we had talked about doing some sort of celebration too, where we were, sorry about that, where we were gonna bring the different boards and commissions in to let us know what they were working on and celebrate their accomplishments throughout the year. Maybe we could figure out a time to bring them in quarterly, if that is something that's feasible.
Quarterly's a lot.
Yeah, what we have right now, I'll talk about kind of what we have, what we started to do, because we did bring you guys those mid-year reports about what they're working on, what their accomplishments were, what their 2025 priorities were, and that was intended to kind of be the opportunity to say, yes, this seems to align, no, I have questions about this. So that was an attempt, right? And that was also the attempt that we want to do that at the end of the year. We do have an annual celebration now for our boards and commission members that we typically host in November for the outgoing commissioner or board members. And ingoing, we'll continue that. We had that at the collective last year with a lot of success, but I know we also used to kind of right before my time have boards and commissions at the end of the year do a quick 10-15-minute presentation, if council's interested in that. I do like, though, however, Councilor Fridlin's suggestion, maybe getting a few of them as well. I would ask perhaps if staff could be involved in that to kind of also brainstorm what's feasible from that, administrative level and all of that. And I think we really can come up with it, because I do hear the concerns. It's, not unique to this community. And doing just a once-a-year work plan feels a little static, so how do we make it a little bit more dynamic? But I would welcome that opportunity to have a discussion with board members that are especially engaged to see what they're envisioning and how it aligns with their goals, if that's okay. I'm open to that idea.
Me? I agree. I like the idea of putting people together, a small group, to kind of find the mechanism by which you do this. I think having staff involved is perfect, but I think it's a great idea. I think it's what we really need is a two-way street, so they can tell us what they want us, but we can also tell them what we're expecting from these boards, because I think that's equally important.
Yeah.
That was part of what is a little frustrating to me, is that we've got advisory boards that it would be great to have them weigh in on some of the issues that come up, but we don't have a process in place. And yes, we could create a process, And it might not be as timely as we need it to be. Because issues do come up. And if we could, in council comments, say like, hey, it would be, how do you feel about having this board or commission weigh in on this question that we have as subject matter experts, understand, and if they understand, their advisors, and that role is to give us their best information. It's another source from residents who are here. And of course, we've got, the experts from the city, and we have our discussions. These are people who are very good at what they do. And sometimes I wish we had more from the Arts and Cultural Resources Board. Did I get that right? Just weighing in, like, how does this really, because I have a hard time connecting what we're doing to the artistic, like, vitality and structure of our city moving forward. Are there things that we could present to them as a question, like, how does this relate to, the success of promoting Lafayette as an artistic, hub of art? I had an alternative, what do you call it? Another reason I can't talk anymore. Being able to ask of our advisory boards to give us help with some things. If it's an obvious, if we obviously have a board that could provide feedback on that. I'll stop talking now.
Right. And we did that once. I think there was an issue that we got 3 boards to provide us some input on that. But I like the two-way street statement is there does need to be that connection, whether they need something or whether we need something.
So if I could recommend that maybe a way forward is that we take the next month for us to talk to our commission and boards and find out who has people that are interested potentially in working with staff. And then I think for those of us who have ideas that maybe relate something in a council meeting, that we do bring it up in council comments, and kind of let's start there, but let's take the next 30 days to kind of see if we have volunteers, and then engage the city manager or designated staff to then plot something forward so it doesn't just die.
Yeah, no, and I would welcome even a counselor or 2 participation as well as perhaps a subcommittee. So we can certainly talk to your boards and commissions, and we could certainly start to put forward a process to.
And we could have at least 2 of us because we won't worry about
You can
posting.
have 2 of you.
And if we have people from across the boards, right? Like, as long as it's not 3 people from one board.
Right.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, great. Seeing that we're a little bit beyond time, I think we're good for the evening. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next Tuesday. We're adjourned.